If a man tells you not to fall in love with him, it's already too late. The first time I saw Adrian Volkov, he was bleeding into my hands in the middle of a rain-soaked alley. The kind of rain that soaks through your jacket in seconds and makes everything feel colder than it should be, like the city itself is holding its breath. And I remember thinking two things at once, that I should walk away and that I couldn't. Because no matter how dangerous a stranger looks, you don't leave someone there. Not when they're barely conscious, not when their fingers twitch like they're trying to hold on to something they're about to lose. So I knelt down, ignoring the water pooling around my knees, ignoring the distant echo of traffic, ignoring the instinct screaming at me to run, and I pressed my scarf against his side just to slow whatever was happening, just to buy him a little more time. And when his eyes opened, sharp and clear like he hadn't been fading just seconds before, I realized I had made a mistake I couldn't take back, because those weren't the eyes of someone helpless. They were the eyes of someone who controlled everything, someone who noticed everything, someone who didn't forget. And he looked at me like I was the unexpected variable in a plan that never failed, like I had stepped into something I didn't understand, and maybe I should have pulled away then. Maybe I should have stood up and walked back into the safe, predictable version of my life where the biggest problem I had was a double shift and a rent payment due in 5 days. But I didn't, because his hand moved, slow but certain, and wrapped around my wrist, not tight, not painful, just enough to stop me. Just enough to tell me I wasn't leaving, and his voice when he spoke was low, controlled, like he didn't waste words on things that didn't matter. "You shouldn't have helped me," he said, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, because something about the way he said it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a fact, like a rule I had already broken, and I shook my head, trying to pull back some control. "You needed help," I said. Simple, obvious, normal, the kind of answer that belongs in a normal world. But he watched me like normal didn't exist where he came from, like kindness was something rare enough to be suspicious. And then he said the words that should have scared me more than they did, the words that should have sent me running. "Don't fall in love with me." And for a second I almost laughed, because nothing about this felt like love. It felt like rain and fear and bad decisions stacking on top of each other. It felt like standing too close to something you don't understand, something you definitely don't belong in. But then headlights cut through the alley, slow, deliberate, and I saw the way his expression didn't change, the way his grip didn't loosen, the way the air shifted like the world itself was adjusting around him. And that's when it hit me, not all at once, but enough to make my chest tighten. I hadn't just helped a stranger, I had stepped into his world. And people like him didn't let things go, they didn't forget, they didn't leave loose ends. And when the car doors opened and men in dark coats stepped out like they already knew where to look, like they had been searching for him, for us, I realized something even worse than the mistake I'd already made. I wasn't walking away from this, not tonight, maybe not ever. And the most dangerous part wasn't the rain or the alley or the men closing in. It was the way he was still looking at me, like I was no longer an accident, like I was already something else. Entirely, something he hadn't planned for, but wasn't going to let go. The car doors closed with a quiet finality that felt louder than any noise in the alley, like a decision had just been made and I was the last one to understand it. And before I could say anything, before I could even pull my wrist free, one of the men stepped forward holding an umbrella over us, shielding Adrian from the rain as if the storm itself was not allowed to touch him. And that was the moment everything shifted, not because of what they did, but because of how they did it, calm, precise, like this was routine, like this was normal, and I suddenly felt out of place in a way I had never felt before, like I had wandered into the wrong scene and everyone else already knew their lines except me. And Adrian finally released my wrist, but the absence of his hand did not feel like freedom. It felt like a pause, temporary, calculated, and he stood on his own like nothing had happened, like the weakness I had seen minutes ago had never existed, adjusting his jacket with one smooth motion, eyes never leaving mine. "You are coming with me," he said, not a question, not even a suggestion, just a statement that settled into the air between us, heavy and unmovable. And I shook my head immediately, instinct kicking in. "No, I am not," I said, the words coming out sharper than I expected, fueled by fear I was trying not to show. "I helped you. That is all. I have to go." But no one moved. Not him, not the men behind him, not even the city around us. And he tilted his head slightly, studying me like I had just said something mildly interesting instead of something that should have ended this interaction. "You saw me," he replied, calm, almost gentle, and that was worse, because there was no anger in his voice, no threat, just certainty. "That makes you part of this now." And my chest tightened, because I knew he believed that. I knew in his world that was enough. And I took a step back, then another, putting distance between us like it might still mean something. "I did not see anything," I said quickly, the lie coming out too fast, too obvious, but it was all I had. "I will forget, I promise." And for a second, just a second, something flickered in his expression, something I could not name, not softness, not quite, but not indifference either. And he stepped closer again, closing the space I had tried to create like it had never existed. "You are not the kind of person who forgets," he said quietly, and I hated that he was right. I hated that he could see that in me from just a few minutes in a rain-soaked alley. And before I could argue, before I could try again to pull away, he gestured once, barely a movement, and one of the men opened the back door of the car waiting at the curb. The interior dimly lit, warm compared to the cold rain outside, and everything in me screamed not to get in, every instinct telling me that once I did, nothing would ever be the same. And I looked at him one last time, searching for something, a reason, a doubt, anything that might give me a way out. But there was nothing there except that same controlled focus, that same quiet authority. And then he said it again, softer this time, like it was meant only for me. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." And I realized something in that moment that made my stomach drop. This was not about force, not really. This was about inevitability, about a decision he had already made. And whether I stepped into that car on my own or not did not change the outcome. It only changed how it would feel later, and my fingers curled into the fabric of my jacket as I stood there for one more second, just one, holding onto the last piece of a life that suddenly felt very far away, before I finally moved, slow, reluctant, stepping past him and into the car, the door closing behind me with a soft click that sounded too final, too certain. And as the engine started and the city lights began to blur past the window, I realized I had not just followed him. I had crossed a line I could not see, into a world that did not ask for permission. And the worst part was not the fear, not the uncertainty. It was the way my mind kept replaying his voice, steady, controlled, impossible to ignore, like a warning I was only beginning to understand. The car did not stop for a long time. Or maybe it only felt that way because every second stretched under the weight of what I had just done, the city outside the window blurring into streaks of light that felt distant and unreachable, like something I had already lost, and no one spoke, not the driver, not the men in the front, not even Adrian, who sat beside me with the same composed stillness he had in the alley, as if movement itself was unnecessary when everything around him adjusted. Without being told, and I kept my hands in my lap, fingers locked together so tightly they hurt, focusing on something small, something controllable, because everything else felt like it was slipping away too fast, and after what felt like miles, the car slowed, turning onto a quieter road lined with tall trees and iron gates that opened before we even reached them, like they had been expecting us, like everything here moved in anticipation of him. And when the car finally stopped, I hesitated, just for a second, because stepping out felt like stepping deeper into something I could not see the end of. But the door opened anyway, and I stepped out into a place that did not feel real, the kind of estate you only see in magazines or movies. Wide stone steps, warm lights glowing through tall windows, everything immaculate, untouched, controlled, and I turned to him, the question sitting in my chest too heavy to ignore. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice quieter now, less defiant than before. And he glanced at me like the answer should have been obvious. "Where you stay," he said simply, already walking toward the entrance, not checking if I would follow because he did not need to. And I stood there for a second longer before moving after him, because staying behind was not an option I actually had. And inside, everything was just as precise: polished floors, soft lighting, the faint scent of something expensive and clean, a space designed to feel calm, but carrying an undercurrent of something else, something controlled, something intentional. And a woman appeared from somewhere to my left, dressed neatly, her expression neutral but attentive, like she had done this before, Like people like me arrived here more often than I wanted to believe. Miss Carter, she said, and the sound of my name made me freeze, because I had never told him, not in the alley, not in the car, not at all. And I looked at Adrian, but he had already moved past us, removing his jacket like nothing about this was unusual, like knowing everything about me was expected, and the woman gestured for me to follow her. "We have prepared a room for you," she continued, calm, efficient, and I shook my head slightly, trying to catch up, trying to hold on to some part of control. "I am not staying," I said, the words weaker than I wanted them to be, and she paused, just briefly, before offering a small, almost sympathetic look. "You are," she replied, not unkindly, just certain, and that certainty was what unsettled me the most, because it was not just him, it was everyone here. Every person moving like this was already decided, already written, and I followed her down a long hallway, past doors that remained closed, past windows that showed nothing but darkness outside, until she stopped at one and opened it, revealing a room that was too perfect, too comfortable, like it had been designed to make me forget where I was. Soft bed, warm lighting, everything in place, everything waiting, and I stepped inside slowly, turning back as she remained in the doorway. "How long?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because I needed something, some kind of answer, some kind of limit. And she hesitated this time, just enough to tell me the truth would not be what I wanted. "That depends," she said quietly, before closing the door behind her, leaving me alone in a room that did not feel like mine, in a place that did not feel temporary. And as the silence settled in, heavier than before, I realized something I had been trying not to admit since the moment I stepped into that car. This was not about safety. Not really. This was about control, and somewhere between the alley and this room, I had gone from a stranger to something else entirely, something he had decided to keep. And the most dangerous part was not that I was trapped here, it was that I did not yet understand why. The door clicked shut behind me, and the silence that followed felt too complete, like even the walls were listening. Like this place was not built for noise or chaos, but for control, and I stood there for a moment without moving, just breathing, trying to slow the pace of my thoughts that kept racing ahead of me, imagining outcomes I did not want to face, until I finally turned and walked further into the room, each step careful, measured, like the floor itself might give something away if I paid enough attention, but everything was perfect, untouched, a bed that looked like no one had ever slept in it, a window that overlooked darkness instead of a street, and I moved toward it anyway, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the faint outline of the gates far below, distant, unreachable, and for a second I considered it, the idea of leaving, of finding a way out, but the thought dissolved as quickly as it came, because deep down I already knew this place was designed so that leaving was not something you simply decided to do, and I let the curtain fall back into place, turning away just as the sound of the door opening again broke the quiet, soft but unmistakable, and I did not need to look to know it was him. The air shifted in a way that made everything else feel secondary, like the room itself adjusted to his presence, and I faced him slowly, refusing to step back even though every instinct told me to create distance, to protect what little control I still had. And he stood near the doorway, sleeves rolled slightly, his expression as composed as ever, like nothing about tonight had been unusual, like bringing someone into his world without explanation was simply part of his routine. "You should eat," he said, his voice even, almost casual, and I stared at him for a second before letting out a quiet breath. "You brought me here without asking," I replied, the words steadier now, grounded in something that felt like defiance. "The least you can do is tell me why." And he watched me in that same focused way, like he was measuring something, like every reaction I gave him was being cataloged, understood, and stored for later, and instead of answering directly, he stepped further into the room, closing the distance between us with slow, deliberate steps that made it impossible to ignore him. "You were in the wrong place," he said finally, and I shook my head immediately. "That is not a reason," I pushed back, refusing to let him reduce this to something simple, something that made sense only in his world. "That is not enough to take someone." And something shifted in his gaze then, not anger, not irritation, but something sharper, something that acknowledged I was not going to accept half answers. And for a moment he was silent. The kind of silence that felt intentional, like he was deciding how much I deserved to know. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but it carried more weight. "It is enough when people know what you saw," he said, and my chest tightened, because this was the first time he had said it plainly, the first time he had not softened the reality of it. And I held his gaze, refusing to look away, even though it felt like standing too close to something that could pull me in if I let it. "Then, let me go," I said, the words coming out softer than before, not because I was weak, but because I was trying something different, trying to find a way through instead of pushing against a wall that would not move. And for the first time since I met him, he did not respond immediately, his eyes studying mine with a depth that made it harder to breathe, like he was searching for something he had not expected to find. And when he finally spoke, it was not what I wanted to hear, not even close. "No," he said simply, and there was no force in it, no raised voice, just certainty, the kind that did not need to prove itself. And I felt something inside me shift then, not fear exactly, but understanding, a quiet realization settling into place. This was not temporary, not something that would resolve itself if I just waited long enough. And I crossed my arms, holding onto the last piece of resistance I had left. "You cannot keep someone just because it is easier for you," I said, and for a fraction of a second, something almost unreadable passed through his expression, something that looked dangerously close to truth. "It is not about easy," he replied, his voice lower now, closer, like the words were meant to stay between us. "It is about necessary." And the way he said it made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the walls had moved closer without me noticing. And I realized then that whatever line I thought I had crossed before, I was still only at the beginning of it, because this was not just about being here. This was about why he was not letting me leave, and the answer to that question was something I was not ready to understand yet. He did not leave right away, and that was what unsettled me the most. Not his words, not the certainty behind them, but the way he stayed, like he was waiting for something, like this was not finished yet. And I held my ground even as the silence stretched between us, thick and deliberate, until I finally broke it, because standing there pretending I was not affected was becoming impossible. "Necessary for what?" I asked, my voice quieter now but sharper, more focused, because if I was trapped here, I deserved at least the truth, or something close to it. And he exhaled slowly, the first sign that this conversation required something from him too, something beyond control, beyond simple commands. And he moved past me toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just slightly, not enough to reveal anything meaningful, just enough to glance out like he was confirming something unseen, before letting it fall back into place. "For you to stay alive," he said, and the words landed heavier than I expected, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just flat, factual. And I felt my breath catch for a second, because part of me had known, part of me had understood that this was not just about him, but hearing it said out loud made it real in a way I could not ignore. And I shook my head, trying to push back against the implication. "That does not make sense," I replied, though it did, more than I wanted to admit. "I am not part of your world." And he turned then, looking at me like I had just stated something irrelevant, something that no longer applied. "You were not," he corrected, calm, precise. And that single word sent a quiet chill through me, because it meant the boundary I had relied on, the separation between his life and mine, no longer existed. And I crossed my arms tighter, holding on to whatever resistance I could still find. "Then explain it to me," I insisted, because guessing was worse. Imagining was worse. And for a moment he just watched me, that same assessing gaze, like he was deciding how much I could handle, how much I should know. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled than before. "People noticed," he said, and I frowned slightly, not understanding at first. "Noticed what?" I asked, and he stepped closer again, not enough to intimidate, just enough to narrow the space between us, to make sure I was paying attention. "That you were there," he replied, and the simplicity of it made my stomach drop, because I understood now, not fully, but enough. Enough to know that walking away that night had never been an option the moment someone else saw me standing beside him. And I let out a slow breath, my thoughts catching up to a reality I had been trying to avoid. "So this is protection," I said quietly, testing the word, seeing how it felt. and his expression did not change, but something in the silence confirmed it, at least partially, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him, trying to make sense of it, trying to find the edges of this situation, where it began, where it might end, and then I looked back at him, meeting his gaze directly. "And when it is over?" I asked, because that mattered. That was the part one needed to hold on to, the idea that this had an end, a limit, something I could count on. And for the first time since this started, he hesitated, just a fraction, just enough to make something inside me tighten, because hesitation from someone like him meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant there was no clear answer. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady again, but the pause had already said enough. "You will be safe," he said, and I let out a quiet, almost humorless breath, because that was not what I asked, that was not the answer I needed, and he knew it. I could see it in the way his eyes held mine, unflinching, unapologetic, and something shifted inside me then, something subtle but undeniable, because up until now, this had felt like something happening to me, something I was caught in without choice. But now I understood something else, something more dangerous. This was not just about survival, not just about being kept here for a reason. That made sense in his world. This was about him deciding I was worth keeping, and that decision did not come with a timeline, did not come with conditions I could control, and I swallowed slowly. The realization settling deeper than I wanted it to, because the most unsettling part was not that I was here, not even that I could not leave. It was the way he was still looking at me, like the situation had already shifted into something more than necessary, something he had not planned for, but was not willing to stop. The silence between us did not break right away, and when it finally did, it was not because of him. It was because of me, because standing there waiting for answers that were never going to come was starting to feel like surrender, and I refused to let that happen. Not completely. Not yet. So I stepped back, creating space where I could, even if it was only symbolic, and I moved toward the small table near the window, placing my hands against the edge just to ground myself, just to remind my body that I was still in control of something. Even if it was only where I stood, and I could feel his gaze follow me, steady, unwavering, like distance did not change anything for him, like he did not need to be close to keep control of the situation. "You said this was necessary," I said, my voice calmer now, not because I was less afraid, but because I was starting to understand that fear was not useful here, not with someone like him. "So what happens if I do not follow your rules?" And the question hung in the air longer than I expected, because it was not just a challenge, it was a line, one I needed to draw for myself even if it did not change anything for him. And when he answered, his tone did not shift, did not harden. It remained the same controlled calm that made everything he said feel more serious, more real. "You will," he said simply, and something about the certainty in his voice made my chest tighten, not because it was threatening, but because it was absolute, like he had already accounted for every possible version of this conversation, every reaction I could have, and none of them changed the outcome. And I let out a quiet breath, shaking my head slightly as I turned to face him again. "You do not know me," I replied, and for the first time, there was a hint of something different. In his expression, something almost subtle enough to miss, but I caught it, the smallest shift, like the idea itself interested him, like I had just introduced a variable he had not fully explored, and he took a step closer, slow, deliberate, closing the distance again. "I know enough," he said, and I frowned, because that was not possible, not from a single night, not from a moment in an alley. And yet the way he said it made it sound like fact, like he had already decided what kind of person I was, and I felt something rise in me then. Not fear, not exactly, but something stronger, something closer to frustration, because I refused to be reduced to something simple, something predictable, especially by someone who controlled everything else around him. "Then you are wrong," I said, the words steady, firm, and for a second, just a second, the room felt different, like something had shifted beneath the surface, like I had pushed against something that actually existed, and his gaze sharpened slightly, not anger, not irritation, but focus, deeper than before, like he was seeing me more clearly now, not just as a situation, not just as a problem to manage, but as something else, something that required more attention than he had expected, and that realization settled into the space between us, quiet but undeniable, and neither of us spoke for a moment, because there was nothing simple left to say. And then he moved, not toward the door, not away, but closer still, stopping, just within reach, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence without him touching me. And his voice when he spoke again was lower, quieter, but somehow more intense than anything he had said before. "Then prove it," he said, and the words landed differently than everything else, because they were not in order, not entirely. They were something else, something that shifted the dynamic in a way I was not prepared for. Because suddenly this was not just about him controlling the situation, it was about me stepping into it, about me choosing how I responded, and I held his gaze, not looking away, not backing down, even though my heart was beating faster than I wanted it to, because if there was any chance to reclaim something here, any chance to hold on to who I was before all of this, it started now, in this moment, in the space between his certainty and my refusal to be defined by it. And for the first time since this began, I realized something that changed everything. I was not just reacting anymore. I was part of this, and whether I liked it or not, that meant I had a role to play. One he had not fully anticipated, one he might not be able to control as easily as he thought. For a moment neither of us moved, and the weight of his words settled into the space between us in a way that felt different from everything that had come before, because this was not just control anymore. It was expectation, and I could feel it pressing in from all sides, shaping the air, shaping the way he looked at me, like he was waiting to see which version of me would stand in front of him next, the one who complied or the one who resisted. And I realized something quietly unsettling. He did not actually need me to obey. He needed to understand me, and that made this far more complicated than I had prepared for. So I straightened slightly, letting my hands fall from the edge of the table, forcing myself to stand without anything to hold on to, because if this was a test, then I was not going to pass it by accident. "You think this is something I can prove," I said, my voice steady even though my pulse had not slowed. "But you are the one who decided what I am before I even had a chance to speak." And his gaze did not waver. If anything, it sharpened, like the more I pushed back, the more interested he became, and that realization unsettled me in a way I did not want to admit. Because people like him were not supposed to be curious, they were supposed to be certain, and yet here he was, studying me like I was something he had not fully figured out yet. And I took a small step to the side, shifting the space between us just enough to remind myself that I still had movement, still had choice in how I stood, how I faced him, even if everything else had been taken from me. "You brought me here because it was easier," I continued, quieter now, more deliberate, because I needed him to hear it, to understand that I saw through the version of this he was trying to present, not because it was necessary. And for the first time, there was a pause that did not feel controlled, not entirely. A fraction of a second where something real passed through his expression before it was gone again, replaced by that same composed distance, but I had seen it, and it changed something, because it meant I was not wrong. It meant there was more to this than he was willing to say. And he took a step closer, slow, measured, stopping just in front of me again, close enough that the distance I had tried to create felt meaningless. But this time it did not feel like he was closing in. It felt like he was stepping into the same space, the same moment. And his voice when he spoke was quieter, more precise, like every word had been chosen carefully. "If it were easy," he said, "you would not be here." And the sentence lingered in my mind longer than I expected, because it did not sound like a justification. It sounded like something closer to truth, something that carried weight even if I did not fully understand it yet. And I held his gaze, searching for something, any sign that would tell me where this was going, what this really meant. But all I found was that same intensity, that same focus that never seemed to break. And it made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore, because this was not just about being trapped. This was about being seen, in a way that felt too direct, too precise, like he was looking past everything I tried to hide and finding something I had not intended to show. And I swallowed slowly, steadying myself against that feeling, refusing to let it pull me off balance. "Then let me choose," I said finally, the words coming out softer but more certain than anything I had said before, because this was the only ground I had left, the only thing I could still claim as mine. "If I am part of this now, then let me decide how." And the silence that followed was different from before, heavier, but not empty. like something had shifted beneath the surface, something neither of us had expected. And for the first time since this began, he did not answer right away, did not respond with certainty or control. He just looked at me, really looked. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything again. This was no longer just his decision. Not entirely, because whether he admitted it or not, something about me had already disrupted the way he saw this situation. And the most dangerous part was not what he might do next. It was the fact that I had just stepped into a role he had not planned for, one that neither of us fully understood yet. He did not answer right away, and that silence felt heavier than anything he could have said, because for the first time since I met him, it was not controlled, it was not calculated, it was real, and I could see it in the way his gaze did not shift, in the way his posture remained still but not rigid, like he was holding something back, something he had not planned to face tonight. And I stayed where I was, not moving, not filling the space with words, because I understood now that this moment mattered more than anything that had come before it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, like each word had weight he could not ignore. "You do not get to choose everything," he said, and I nodded slightly, because I knew that. I had known it from the moment I stepped into that car, but I also knew something else now, something he had not accounted for. "I do not need everything," I replied, steady, certain, "just enough." And something shifted then, subtle but undeniable. Like a line had been redrawn between us, not erased, not removed, but changed, and he exhaled slowly, his eyes dropping for just a fraction of a second before returning to mine. And that single movement told me more than anything else could have, because it meant he was thinking, really thinking, not reacting, not controlling, but considering, and that was something I had not expected to see from him, not this soon, not with me. And he turned slightly, pacing once across the room, a small movement but significant, like he needed space to process something that did not fit into the structure he had built for himself. And when he stopped, his back half turned to me, he spoke again. "You stay here," he said, the words measured, but different now, less absolute, more defined. "You do not leave without me knowing." And I watched him carefully, listening not just to what he said, but how he said it, because this was not the same as before. This was not a command meant to close the conversation. It was something else, something closer to a boundary, and I stepped forward slightly, testing the space, testing the shift that had just happened. "And the rest?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but not uncertain, because I could feel it, the change, the way this situation was no longer completely one-sided. And he glanced at me over his shoulder, his expression unreadable for a moment before it settled into something calmer, something more controlled, but not as distant as before. "The rest," he repeated, like the concept itself was unfamiliar, like it was something he had not had to consider in a long time. And then he turned fully to face me again, his gaze steady, but no longer dismissive, no longer reducing me to something simple. "You decide how you spend your time here," he said, and the words landed in a way I did not expect, because they were small, almost insignificant compared to everything else, but they were something real, something I could hold on to. And I nodded once, not because I was accepting everything, not because I was agreeing to stay without question, but because I understood what this meant. I understood that this was not about freedom, not yet, but it was a shift, a crack in the control he had maintained from the beginning. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would not undo what had just changed. And he moved toward the door then, his steps slower than before, like he was aware of the weight of this moment, like he understood that something had shifted not just for me, but for him as well. And just before he reached the door, he paused, his hand resting lightly against the frame, and without turning, he said something that stayed with me long after he left the room. "This does not change what you are to me." And the words echoed in the silence that followed, because they were not a warning, not exactly. They were something closer to truth, something he believed, something he had already decided. And as the door closed behind him, leaving me alone once again, I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around me, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to make sense of a situation that kept shifting beneath my feet. And I realized something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. This was no longer just about staying alive. It was no longer just about being kept here for a reason that made sense in his world. It was becoming something else, something neither of us had planned for. And the most dangerous part was not that I was starting to see it. It was that he was too, even if he had not said it out loud yet. The door had barely settled into silence when I realized the room did not feel the same anymore. Not because anything had changed physically, but because something inside me had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, like a line had been crossed without me noticing the exact moment it happened. And I moved slowly toward the window again, pulling the curtain back just enough to let the faint glow of distant lights spill into the room, grounding myself in something real, something outside of him, outside of this place. And for a moment, I just stood there, breathing, letting the quiet wrap around me, until my thoughts caught up to what he had said, what he had not said, and more importantly, what it meant, because this was no longer just about being here, about surviving something I had accidentally stepped into. This was about understanding why he had not let go, why he had not chosen the easier path. And the answer was there, hidden in the way he looked at me, in the way he hesitated when I asked about leaving, in the way his control had cracked just enough for me to see through it. And I closed my eyes briefly, exhaling slowly as the realization settled deeper, heavier, because it was not something I could ignore anymore, not something I could pretend was not happening. And when I opened them again, I turned away from the window, stepping back into the center of the room, into the space where everything had changed just minutes ago, and I whispered the words under my breath before I could stop myself. This is not just about safety, because it was not anymore. And the thought stayed with me, lingering in the silence like something waiting to be acknowledged. And I did not know how long I stood there before I heard the faint sound of movement outside the door, quiet, controlled, familiar now in a way that unsettled me. And I did not need to turn to know it was him again, because something about his presence had already become impossible to ignore. And when the door opened, I faced him without hesitation, without stepping back this time, because I needed to see it, needed to confirm what I had started to understand. And he paused just inside the doorway, his gaze finding mine immediately, like he had expected me to be there, like this moment had already been accounted for in some way. And neither of us spoke at first, because words felt unnecessary, because everything that mattered was already there in the space between us. And I took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to make this real, just enough to make sure he could not dismiss it as coincidence or misunderstanding. "You said I was necessary," I said, quietly, my voice steady despite the way my chest tightened with each breath. "But that is not the whole truth." And his expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something sharper, more focused, like he was listening now in a way he had not before. And I held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let this moment slip past like all the others. "You could have let me go," I continued, softer now, but more certain, because the realization had settled into something solid, something undeniable. "You did not." And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything else, because this was not a question. It was a statement, one that demanded an answer whether he wanted to give it or not. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw it, the smallest crack in the control he held so tightly, the briefest hesitation that told me I was right. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, quieter, like the words were not meant for anyone else to hear. "You do not understand," he said, but it did not sound like dismissal. It sounded like warning, like something deeper than that. And I shook my head slightly, taking another step closer, because distance did not feel like protection anymore. It felt like avoidance, and I was done avoiding what was right in front of me. "Then explain it," I said, and this time, I did not soften it, did not step back from the edge of what I was asking, because I needed to hear it, needed him to say it out loud. And he looked at me for a long moment, longer than before, like he was weighing something, like he was deciding whether this was a line he was willing to cross. And when he finally spoke, the words were simple, controlled, but they carried something beneath them that made my breath catch. "You became a risk," he said, and I almost let out a breath, almost accepted it as the answer. But then he continued, quieter now, more honest than anything he had said before. "And then something else," and the room seemed to still around us, the air tightening in a way that made everything feel sharper, clearer. And I felt it then, not fear, not confusion, but something far more dangerous, something that made it harder to look away. Harder to pretend this was still just a situation I could walk out of unchanged, and I swallowed slowly, my voice barely above a whisper when I spoke again. What else? And this time, he did not answer right away, did not hide behind certainty or control. He just looked at me. Really looked, like he was seeing something he had not planned for, something he could not ignore. And in that moment, I understood something that changed everything. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer one-sided, no longer something he could define on his own, because whether he admitted it or not, I had already become part of it in a way neither of us could undo. And the most dangerous part was not what he might say next, it was the fact that I was no longer sure I wanted him to let me go.